did. But you took on that problem with me when you took me, Red.
Hollywood. The Golden Age. A city of manufactured dreams where the studio system built gods out of ordinary men and women, and then demanded those gods live by rules that would have broken anyone else. Morality clauses. Arranged marriages. Carefully crafted press releases. Gossip columnists on the payroll. And behind every perfect publicity photo, behind every heterosexual romance staged for the fan magazines, was a private world that the studios spent millions keeping buried. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on 13 of classic Hollywood's most iconic male stars, men whose talent dazzled audiences around the world, whose physical magnetism made them legends, and whose private lives were considered so dangerous, so explosive, that even decades later, the full truth still makes network executives nervous. These are their stories, drawn from published biographies, posthumous memoirs, court records, and the oral histories of those who knew them best. This is not gossip. This is history. Before we can talk about anyone else, we have to start here. Marlon Brando. The man who changed acting forever. The man who threw away the rulebook with a streetcar named Desire in 1951 and never looked back. The brooding, magnificent, impossible Marlon Brando. What the studio system never wanted you to know was that Brando's private life was as revolutionary as his art. Darwin Porter's exhaustively researched 2006 biography Brando Unzipped, drawing on hundreds of interviews with contemporaries, co-stars, and intimates, paints a portrait of a man who lived by his own rules in every dimension of his life. Brando was, by multiple accounts and eventually by his own admission, bisexual. He pursued relationships with men and women with equal intensity, equal curiosity, and equal disregard for what society expected of him. In a landmark 1976 interview with a French publication, Brando stated plainly, "Homosexuality is so much in fashion. Like a large number of men, I too have had homosexual experiences, and I am not ashamed." For 1976, that was an earthquake. For a man of Brando's stature, it was practically unheard of. His 1994 autobiography songs My Mother Taught Me is more guarded, but the picture that emerges from biographies, from the accounts of those who shared his world, is of a man who considered sexuality fluid long before that language existed in popular culture. His physical presence was legendary, not just on screen. Multiple biographies reference the near-mythological quality of Brando's physicality as part of the broader culture of awe that surrounded him. He was the ultimate rebel, in body and spirit, and Hollywood, for all its attempts to control him, never quite managed it. Born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. in Winnetka, Illinois, Rock Hudson became one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood history. Magnificent obsession. Giant. Pillow talk. A face so classically handsome it seemed almost unreal. And behind that face, one of the most elaborately constructed false identities the studio system ever produced. Hudson was gay. He knew it. His agent, the powerful and manipulative Henry Wilson, knew it. Universal Pictures knew it. And all of them agreed, the public must never find out. Wilson engineered a sham marriage to his own secretary, Phyllis Gates, in 1955. The marriage lasted 3 years. When Gates later confronted Hudson, in a conversation that was secretly recorded, he reportedly acknowledged that his deeper emotional and physical connections were with men. The marriage was dissolved quietly, with legal agreements that kept the full story sealed for decades. Armistead Maupin, author of Tales of the City and a man who moved in the same circles as Hudson in later years, has spoken candidly in interviews about what those who knew Hudson privately understood about him. In underground Hollywood social circles, Hudson's charisma and physical presence made him a figure of considerable legend. When Rock Hudson died of AIDS-related complications in October 1985, he became the first major American celebrity to publicly acknowledge an AIDS diagnosis. His death cracked the studio closet wide open, not just for his own legacy, but for the entire conversation about gay men in Hollywood. Biographer Mark Griffin's All That Heaven Allows remains the definitive account of Hudson's life, a story of talent, beauty, captivity, and ultimately, tragic liberation too late. Few actors in the history of cinema have been more effortlessly charming than Archibald Alec Leach, known to the world as Cary Grant. North by Northwest. Bringing Up Baby. The Philadelphia Story. He was, by almost any measure, the most elegant man who ever walked in front of a camera. Grant was married 5 times. 5 women. And yet, the most significant relationship of his young life, by multiple accounts, including those of the man himself, was with costume designer Ori Kelly, with whom he shared apartments and a creative life in New York's bohemian Greenwich Village from the mid-1920s into the early 1930s. Ori Kelly's posthumous memoir Women I've Undressed, brought to life in the 2015 documentary Women He's Undressed, addresses the relationship with a frankness that Grant himself never publicly embraced. Kelly describes shared poverty, shared ambition, shared living quarters, and a bond that went beyond mere friendship. When Kelly died in 1964, Grant served as a pallbearer at his funeral, one of the few tangible public acknowledgments of how deeply their lives had been intertwined. Grant himself was famous for deflecting. His quip, "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant," was charming. It was also, in retrospect, a coded acknowledgment that the persona was exactly that, a persona. Archibald Leach, the poor kid from Bristol, had invented Cary Grant from the ground up. And Cary Grant's sexuality was, like everything else about him, exactly as polished and as carefully managed as his wardrobe. James Dean lived for 24 years. In that time, he made 3 films. And he became one of the most enduring icons in the history of American culture. East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, Giant, The Rebel, The Vulnerable One, The Boy Who Never Got to Become a Man. What the fan magazines didn't print was that Dean's private life was chaotic, searching, and deeply complicated. Multiple biographies, including John Gilmore's Live Fast, Die Young, and Val Holly's James Dean, the biography, describe a young man who moved through both male and female relationships with an intensity that reflected his broader emotional volatility. Dean's connection to Brando, the man he idolized, competed with, and reportedly conducted a complex, charged relationship with, is one of the most discussed open secrets of 1950s Hollywood. Darwin Porter's research suggests their dynamic was as much personal as professional, a collision of 2 of the most magnetic personalities of their era. Dean reportedly also used his beauty and charisma transactionally in his early Hollywood years, trading on his looks for roles and opportunities in a system that had always operated that way, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. Friends describe a young man perpetually searching for himself, in his work, in his relationships, in the characters he inhabited on screen. His tragedy was not just his early death. It was the closet that would have awaited him had he lived. If Cary Grant was elegant and Brando was raw, Tyrone Power was simply devastating. Dark, classically handsome, an athlete's body and an aristocrat's face. 20th Century Fox built an empire on Tyrone Power in the late 1930s and 1940s. The Mark of Zorro, Blood and Sand, The Razor's Edge. Behind the Latin lover image, and the multiple marriages, Power lived a private life of considerable complexity. Biographies, including Hector Arce's The Secret Life of Tyrone Power, describe a man who conducted deep, genuine emotional affairs with men throughout his life, even as his studio identity was built on heterosexual romance. His rumored connection to Errol Flynn, the 2 were close friends and frequent companions, is addressed in multiple sources, with biographers noting that the friendship likely encompassed more than swashbuckling camaraderie. Power, unlike some of his peers, seemed to genuinely feel the emotional weight of his hidden relationships. The affairs he conducted with men were described by those who observed them as tender, serious, and real, not merely physical. Power died in 1958 at 44, collapsing on a film set in Spain. He was buried with the secrets of his private life largely intact. It was only in subsequent decades, as biographers gained access to letters, private correspondence, and the recollections of those who had outlived him, that the full picture began to emerge. Montgomery Clift may be the most heartbreaking figure in this entire story. A genius. Genuinely one of the greatest actors of the 20th century. A Place in the Sun. From Here to Eternity. The Misfits. Acting so interior, so true, that watching him on screen sometimes feels almost voyeuristic. Clift was gay, or, at minimum, primarily attracted to men, in an era when that was not merely socially unacceptable but professionally catastrophic and legally dangerous. His long and devoted friendship with Elizabeth Taylor, who adored him completely, provided some emotional shelter. But the studio system, the tabloid press, and the ever-present threat of exposure meant that Clift lived under a kind of permanent psychological siege. A 1956 car crash that partially disfigured his face accelerated his personal unraveling. He had always struggled with addiction. After the accident, the struggles intensified. Biographers, including Patricia Bosworth in her definitive 1978 biography, describe a man whose inner life was as complex and as painful as the characters he played. A man who had never been given the freedom to simply be himself. The blackmail risks faced by gay actors of Clift's era were not abstract. There were professionals in Hollywood whose entire business model was the threat of exposure. Clift, like many of his contemporaries, navigated this minefield with the constant awareness that his career, and potentially his freedom, depended on secrecy. He died in 1966, alone, at 45. The tragedy of Montgomery Clift is the tragedy of a system that took one of the most gifted human beings of his generation and slowly, methodically crushed him. Forever Norman Bates. Forever the twitchy, uncomfortable, electrifying presence that Hitchcock captured in Psycho in 1960. Anthony Perkins was one of the most interesting actors of his generation, and one of the most conflicted human beings Hollywood ever produced. Perkins conducted a genuine, tender romance with fellow actor Tab Hunter in the late 1950s. Tab Hunter later wrote about this period in his autobiography, describing their time together at Hollywood's Chateau Marmont as real, as meaningful, as something that mattered to both of them in ways that went beyond the physical. But Perkins was also tortured by his sexuality in ways that Hunter was not. He sought therapy repeatedly, in attempts to change his orientation, a reflection not of personal failure but of the era's brutal messaging about what he was supposed to be. He later married and had children. He conducted affairs throughout his marriage. He was, by almost every account, a man permanently at war with himself. When Perkins died of AIDS-related complications in 1992, his family initially attempted to conceal the cause of death, a final, futile act of the same secrecy that had defined his entire life. The fuller picture that emerged in subsequent years was of a man of